So what is better, turbos, superchargers, or nitrous? Really, the answer to that question depends on what question you actually ask. Today on Off Camber, we're going to look into how this stuff works and what could be the best solution for you. Spoiler alert, the answer is actually, it depends for what we want to do with our car or truck. Welcome to Off Camber. I'm Jason Jackman, and this is Off Camber. Welcome back if you're returning, and if you're brand new to the channel and like what you see here, go ahead and hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and do us all a favor and subscribe. Tell us what you think of this episode, and if you got any ideas for future ones, I'm all ears. Also, if you keep coming back and you haven't hit that subscribe button, I see the stats. You guys are coming back. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get to business. First, let's talk about turbos, superchargers, and nitrous, and what they actually are and how they create that power. And then we could talk about applications of that horsepower. We'll keep it pretty simple, but we'll dive deep enough so that you know all the terminology and can talk about any of this stuff intelligently. All right, so there's a lot of parts to a turbo, but let's talk about it in very basic terms. There's the turbine side, commonly referred to as the exhaust or the hot side, and you have the compressor side or the cold side. The process is the turbine spins up from the exhaust gases. As they pass from the exhaust port in the head, they head out into the header, and they go up into the turbine side of the turbo. They go through the turbo and exit through the exhaust outlet into the downpipe, passing the wastegate and out of the car. Now that wastegate plays a key role in how fast that turbine is allowed to spin before it starts venting gases. That can be controlled with a spring or CO2 or something of that nature, but we're not going to get sidetracked there. As the exhaust gases enter, they spin the turbine wheel. This wheel is connected to the main shaft that runs through the housing to the compressor side. In this center section between the hot and cold side, there's an oil inlet, some bearings, and an oil drain. This all lubricates the bearings to keep the main shaft spinning and cool the shaft. There are oil seals, thrust bearings to limit in-play, and journal bearings to help direct the oil flow, similar to the way a crankshaft rotates in an engine block, except here the waste, or the fourth stroke from the combustion process, drives the rotation of the shaft. Let's move over to the intake side. Here, you're drawing outside air through the intake, moving it into the compressor housing. The compressor wheel is spinning because it's connected to the turbine. The compressor wheel has blades on it that are angled, and as it enters this side, it gets compressed between the wheel and the compressor housing. All right, to get a hold of this idea, we need to talk about thermodynamics again. More specifically, the ideal gas law. A simple way to think about this is, if the volume of air is constant and the temperature rises, the pressure is going to increase. Remember, like we talked about on the 4-stroke episode before, that the temperature is directly proportional to the volume and the pressure of the air. Haven't watched that episode yet? Check out the link above to go ahead and watch that, but do it after this. Now, this temperature increase from compressing that air is why intercoolers enter the system or people choose different types of fuel to run. Now, it's really pretty much simplifying it, and we can dive a lot deeper into airflow characteristics by talking about wheel designs, talking about housing designs, but we'd have to do the episode entirely on the turbo to get that detailed about it. If you do want to deep dive a turbo and talk about how all that stuff works, leave a comment below, and we'll maybe make an episode about it. I think it could be interesting, but I kind of like to nerd out about stuff like that. In any case, let's get back to the compressor side of things, since that's where the charged air comes from. Now that turbo takes air in from the front of the turbo, outside the car, and it changes the direction of the air 90 degrees. Because it changes that, we call it a radial compressor. Then it either sends the air through an intercooler or it sends it directly into the throttle body, depending on fueling, all sorts of stuff. There are tons of variation on how this is done. You can run it on ethanol, you can run it on methanol, you can run it on race fuel, you can run lower boost, higher boost. Those decisions are going to determine whether or not you run an intercooler on it. Again, if you want a deep dive about how complicated this stuff gets, get at me in the comments. So here's the downfall of the turbo. And anybody that likes superchargers is going to bring this up immediately. Because the exhaust drives the turbine, it is a throttle-dependent system. What that means is that the air gets compressed based off of the throttle input you give it. The more throttle you give it, the faster that turbine spins, because the more exhaust gases you're creating, the faster it's going to spin that turbine, the faster it's going to spin that compressor wheel, the more air it's going to compress. So to think about it, if you only push the throttle half open and it only opens that throttle plate halfway, what it's going to do is it's going to let in that amount of air. Now it's going to go through the full 4-stroke combustion process, and it's going to push out any waste gases out of the exhaust ports. The thing about that is if you only let a certain amount of air in, it can only push so much out, which means that the turbo is only going to spin so fast and it's only going to create so much boost. So the less you push on that throttle, the less boost it's going to produce, because you're only letting a little bit of air in. As you open that throttle plate up, more air rushes in, more boost gets produced. We should also at this point probably talk about the blow-off valve. Now this is the cool whoop whoopsh, whoopsh noise you hear, right? That everybody wants to have with a turbo car. The quick explanation of this is that when the throttle plate is wide open, you're pulling in all this air. It's pushing as much air as it can out of the turbo. Everything's going great. Well, as soon as you let off the throttle, that throttle plate shuts. Instead of all that air bouncing off that throttle plate, going back into the compressor and stalling that compressor out, it will release through the blow-off valve. These blow-off valves can be controlled by CO2 or springs, depending on the application that you put into it. CO2 is more of a drag car thing. But what you're doing, other than making cool sounds, is you're preventing the compressor wheel from getting damaged. While it won't damage it immediately, if it continually surges the pressure backwards and stalls that compressor wheel out, you're going to damage the bearings, you're going to damage the compressor wheel, you're going to damage all sorts of stuff, and eventually that turbo is going to come apart on you. All right, so let's talk about superchargers next. There's two types we're going to talk about to keep it simple, but we'll talk about a couple variations of each type. The two we're going to talk about are centrifugal and screw types. So let's go over centrifugal supercharger first. It's pretty similar to the way that a turbo works on the cold side, in that it brings the air into the front, spins the wheel inside, compresses the air, and sends it out of the housing. Now, these centrifugal chargers are mostly belt driven, but there are pretty slick units out there that use gearbox that are driven directly by the crank. So basically you bolt up a gear drive and you connect it to the crankshaft instead of using a belt to drive that unit. So the benefit to a gear drive setup is that it uses a gearbox to drive the supercharger instead of a belt. That's going to help in high horsepower situations, high boost situations, because the belts tend to slip, which is why you see stuff like 10 and 12 rib belts out there, or 10 and 12 rib pulleys out there that will keep the belt from slipping. For the belt type, you'll go ahead and change that pulley to increase boost. You can also increase power by adding timing, stuff like that, but you're really kind of limited to how much boost the unit will produce based off of the volume inside the unit and the pulley size. So on the gear drive style, instead of changing pulleys to increase boost, what you do is you go into that gear drive and you change the input and output gear in order to change the boost ratios. That's real similar to the way that like a quick change rear end works, if anybody's familiar with that. One of the major benefits to the gear drive setup is that you don't get a lot of wasted energy that you would with the belt. Either the downside or the upside to a supercharger is that the boost is created mechanically, meaning that the crankshaft drives the supercharger, either through a gearbox or through a belt system. Because of this, the boost is more linear. That means the engine will act mostly like it just has more displacement. Now, the next style of supercharger also has a couple of different configurations, but it is the oldest type of supercharger in the market, and we call it the root style blower. It uses a 2 or 3 lobe motor to move air through it. Most of the modern stuff uses 3 lobes, but the compression of the air actually takes place in the intake manifold of a root style blower. The rotors move in opposite directions from each other with a timing gear to keep them in sync. What happens is the rotors will spin and they'll trap the air in between the casing and the rotors and then push the air into the intake manifold. Now the intake manifold will resist all that extra air being pushed in, and so it builds pressure. So this is a very good example of why you'll hear people say boost is a function of restriction, because as it pushes that air into the intake manifold doesn't have enough volume, so it tries to resist that. The pressure will increase and it'll push it through. But it's also why when you increase the efficiency of the engine, the boost levels will actually drop, but you'll create more power. The Blower Shop and Magnuson both use root style blowers. The Blower Shop, if you haven't seen them, are the ones that sit on top of the engine, look super cool. That's the 1071s, 871s, stuff like that. Mike Finnegan's Blasphemy runs one of those. Magnuson also uses a root style blower, but their blowers have a few more twists on them than standard rotors. And Roots units are mostly known for creating immense amounts of low end and mid range power. They also generate a lot more heat. Then we have a twin screw style, and that's what a Whipple is. These are known for the efficiency they have and the amount of boost they create just right out of the hole. They actually punch you through the chest, and they sound absolutely magical. They use the same general method to create boost as the root style blowers, but the rotors look like screws. Again, they spin in the opposite direction, but the main difference here is the twin screw actually compresses the air inside the blower unit. The way that it compresses air inside the blower is that you have one screw that's pulling air in from the intake, and it's driving it down the screw, and it's moving the opposite direction of the other screw, and the rotors have a conical taper to them. So as it pushes that air down the rotors, it moves it into a smaller and smaller space, which compresses the air. So last but not least, let's get to the bottle. Nitrous, breaking hearts and engine internals since the early 1940s. Fun fact, the first time that nitrous was used to increase the performance of an engine was in World War II aircraft. And the reason they used nitrous in airplane engines is that as the planes went up in altitude, the air thins out. So in order to supplement that, They added nitrous to the engines so that the plane would perform at different elevations. So that kind of explains how nitrous actually works. It's obviously 2 nitrogen molecules and 1 oxygen molecule. So the way that this works is as you heat up the nitrous, it will release its oxygen molecule. It happens at 570 degrees Fahrenheit and some nonsensical number in Celsius. I don't know. And all this happens when it gets into the combustion chamber. Well, more air means it runs more lean, right? Oh, that's right. So that's why we have to add more fuel into the mixture also. Now, there are dry shots of nitrous, but those only go up to a certain horsepower rating, and then you have to add more fuel because it just leans it out too much. But the bonus to nitrous is it's actually twofold. As you release that extra oxygen and nitrogen into the intake stream, it actually cools the charged air as well. So the nitrogen cools the air and actually packs more air into that same spot. So then you add fuel to ignite all that oxygen, and bang, more horse torques. There's a couple of different ways to deliver nitrogen. Most often nowadays, you're going to see it done through solenoids in a fuel injection system, but you can do it straight into the intake stream. You'll see those Y-shaped nozzles that have fuel on one side, nitrous on the other, and it's controlled by jets. Or you can put it on a plate between the throttle body or carb and the intake manifold. So what's the best for you? That's really not an easy question to answer. As we talked about earlier, that screw style and that root style blower is going to give you an instant kick in the pants with the horsepower and the torque right out of the hole, especially with like a Whipple. Those things are just brutal out of the hole. So maybe that's what you're looking for drag racing. I don't know. But I will tell you, with modern turbos and two-step systems, you can get the boost up on a turbo sitting on the line. So the advantage the Supercharger has is almost entirely taken away with modern day management systems. But a turbo still ramps up the boost based off of exhaust pressures, and it doesn't rise at a constant rate like a Supercharger does. And it's a bit more versatile in the way that you can control the boost. Road racing, maybe the Supercharger is the answer for you, but again, that creates a lot of heat, and you're going to have to worry about that if you're running on a road course for a long period of time. Then there's nitrous. Nitrous is by far the most intimidating. Pull up to a stoplight in your truck, there's some douchebag over there in his Ferrari. Here's your motor burbling, laughs at you a little bit about how your stuff's all primitive. There's nothing better than bringing that thing up on the trans brake and purging the nitrous system right before the light goes green. You're going to make that dude second guess every decision he's ever made about automotive purchases. But the downside, if you run a big shot of nitrous, you have to tune the engine to run on a big shot of nitrous, which means that if you're not spraying, it's probably not running that well. So in the end, like we said right at the beginning of the video, I guess the answer is it depends. And it's really up to you. I personally prefer turbos, but I also really, really love the way a Whipple sounds. Like if I were going to have strictly a street car, like those F-150 street trucks you see out there, I'd probably almost definitely bolt a Whipple charger to it. But if you ask me about a car that I'm going to do drag racing with, it's getting turbos. The reasoning is pretty simple actually too. It's just easier to manage the power. It's easier to increase or decrease the power based off of boost settings. You can do it on a per gear basis. With modern day management systems, you can let it have so much timing and so much boost out of the hole and ramp it up after a second so you can get that thing to hook. And as it starts hooking, you can move it down the track. There's all sorts of tricks to it. With modern day management, the advantages the Supercharger had, in my opinion, are pretty much over. And remember how we talked about Superchargers pulling straight out of the hole real hard? Well, another advantage to turbos is they pull real hard out the back end. So here's a video from Cletus McFarland where they had 2 identical F-150 pickups. One of them they put a Whipple charger on, the other one they put twin turbos on. And when you watch it, you can see that the turbo pulls harder out of the back half. And it isn't a crazy difference at the power levels they're running them at, but 2 to 3 mile an hour trap speed gained after the 8th mile marker is that thing freight training the Supercharger truck at the top end. And this video does just a really great job of illustrating the differences between a Supercharger and a turbocharger setup. Now for a street truck, I definitely go with the Whipple just because it would be an absolute riot. The instant on power is just intoxicating with those. You aren't having to worry about staging at a light and bringing the thing up on boost. Nope, pull up to the light, bring it up on the converter, light goes green, let it go, and just let her rip. Now, I haven't talked about nitrous so much on the street because, to be honest with you, it's probably just not a great option on the street if you're going with a giant shot of nitrous. It just isn't going to run well unless you are constantly squeezing. And refilling nitrous bottles all the time, in my opinion, would be a giant pain in the ass. But on the track, they are formidable competitors. You can make a ton of power with a nitrous car. The problem is that they've got to be built for it. and they just aren't going to run right without it. So in the end, you ask me my opinion, I'm saying the turbo wins for the best all-arounder. You don't like what I have to say? Fight me down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video today. Next week, we're going to go ahead and start on our Miata project. I was going to do it this week, but Thanksgiving kind of took away half of our week. If you aren't subscribed, remember to smash that button for me and subscribe. I promise it doesn't even hurt a little bit. And if you liked the video, smash the like button and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching today. I'm glad you came, and I hope you enjoyed your time here. And I hope to see you next time on Off Camber.